a very packed 2 hours ahead of us this morning, and I hope we'll be able to really have a wonderful and fruitful conversation about trauma and abuse in individual lives as well as in relationships. So the title of today's conversation is Triggered by Trauma, Understanding Trauma and Abuse in Relationships. To start with, what I'd like us to do is to try and recognize what trauma and abuse are. What are they? So I would like our panelists to share their opinions from their wealth of knowledge and experience on what trauma and abuse are. Are they the same thing? Does one lead to another? Do they influence each other? Are they standalone concepts on their own? I will start with Shazmin. Please go ahead and share with us your opinions on what trauma and abuse are.
So I would say it's a very interesting question because it's a pretty big topic. You know, you look at trauma, and I would say trauma and abuse go hand in hand, but there are two ways of looking at it, because you have trauma that's also self-inflicted as well as abuse, which is self-inflicted, and then you have trauma and abuse which comes together from other people outside, in your family, in your circle, in your relationships, you know, in your own lives. So I would say abuse probably comes as something that, you know, it's big if we look at it just in a context of relationships, because a lot of people don't realize sometimes you're in an abusive, very toxic relationship, and you have somebody that's either verbally abusing you, emotionally abusing you, mentally abusing you. And over a period of time, it tends to cause trauma within you because you have little triggers that start to bring out how you feel. So I would say, you know, that abuse comes first, and then it causes trauma, which is something that stays within the body, and triggers around you or being in the same relationship or with people around you sort of bring it up. It starts in so many different forms. You have abuse with children who are molested. You have abuse from children who have been neglected by their parents. So it starts, like I would say, from a younger age in so many different forms. So it is a really, really wide and big topic, because when you look at it, there are so many ways in which people do get abused. If we're singling it down to just relationship, then it's female to also abuse men in relationships, as well as men that abuse women. Personally, I experienced that as well, which is what pulled me into this line of being able to work with women, work with men. Surprisingly, a lot of men actually that are abused in relationships, and they just cannot voice and cannot talk about it because it's not masculine enough to be able to voice and say your lady, your woman hits you. In the same regard, it comes, you know, as a trauma from a lot of men who have been molested and hit by their mothers or their fathers or uncles. So it kind of is one or the other. It flows together. You can't do one without the other. That would be the shortest way that I would be able to put it in for you right now.
Thank you, Shazmin, for your input. And I just want to, yes, though the topic for today is about understanding trauma and abuse in relationships. But you see, just like you said, some people will experience trauma in their personal lives, either from childhood or from other experiences. And even though the trauma is something that has personally happened to them, it can affect their relationships. So that's why I keep moving in between trauma happening to someone in their personal lives and the influence of trauma also in relationships. Thank you, Shazmin. Shagun Matthews, can we have your input on that? What is trauma? What is abuse?
Hi,
How is one different from another? Thank you.
yeah, Chasmi, thank you for that input. I think you put some light to it. But I just want to add a bit. Actually, okay, what is abuse? Abuse are experiences, are negative or adverse experiences that leave a dysfunctional impact on a person. That means experience that happened, a negative experience that happened that is not pleasant. But the trauma is how the person feels from the abuse. So the trauma is the experience, how the impact, the consequence of that abuse on the victim. So the trauma is an experience that often involve a threat to one's life or one's safety. So I think you will agree with me that once somebody has gone through, or anybody that is going through abuses, they feel threatened, their life is threatened, and they feel unsafe. So that feelings that come with the abuse is what is trauma. That's why we call it traumatic experience. That means the experience happened, how it impact on you is the trauma. So the abuse is the experience. The trauma is the impact on the victim that is going through, or that has gone through, or the survivor that has gone through the negative experience or the abuse experience. So I just want to simplify it that way.
Thank you for that clarity that you have provided on the topic. I would like to say a big welcome to a third panelist for this morning, Yemi Oludele Dari. You're very welcome. We're glad that you're able to join us. At the same time, I am welcoming Betsy Bisitaiwo, Mrs. Bird, Adetola Adewale, Olawumi. You're welcome. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Nimot.
Thank you
also,
so much.
I see you. Thank you. So Yemi Oludele Dari is our third panelist. You're welcome, ma'am. Would like you to introduce yourself to all of us this morning. The floor is yours.
All right. I'm sorry that I had a bit of mix-up. It's been a long 2 weeks for me. I'm really sorry about that. Yes, my name is Yemi Oludele Dari, and I'm a certified professional counselor and psychotherapist. I like to focus on grief, trauma, addiction, abuse, and depression. I'm really glad to be on this platform today. I hope I can make 1 or 2 contributions. Very well.
So I'm going to throw you straight up into the deep end, Yemi Oludele Dari. What are some of the signs of trauma and abuse? There will be some obvious signs. There will be some not so obvious, inconspicuous signs. Just tell us. And before you do that, I don't know if any one of us lives in Ireland here. I don't know if we have any members of our audience who stays in Ireland. This particular question came up for me because a couple of weeks ago, about 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks ago, there was on Sky News, the news item was they have this facility they called Mother and Baby Homes in Ireland, where I guess single mothers, they go there to have their babies. So I think it's a form of social welfare system to help unwed mothers to take care of their children. Unfortunately, I guess over the years, there has been some kind of abuse going on in those facilities, in those homes. And there was an investigation that was conducted by the government of Ireland, by the Irish government, and the report was released. The report is, way over 2,000 pages. But the issue here is one of the victims, one of the babies who had been born in those homes, I'm talking in the 70s, in the 60s and the 50s. This woman should be about in her late 60s or 70s, and her experiences while in those mother and babies homes, she was asked to just share her opinions on what she feels, given the report that has just been released. And the Irish government, gave a big apology to all the people who had suffered in one way or another in those homes. What struck me was years, I'm talking decades after this woman had left those, the home where she was brought up in with, I could sense the pain in her demeanor when she spoke about having been transferred from one mother and baby home to another, not having stability. And what struck me was this woman is traumatized. And I wonder if she has been able to get adequate help for what she has gone through. I think about what Mr. Matthews has explained to us about what trauma and what abuse is. Abuse is the negative experience, and then trauma is the impact it has on the individual. And I think about that elderly woman who has, she has left that scenario like some 40, 50 years ago, but still you can sense the trauma as she relates her experiences. It's not very obvious on her. You may look at her and think she's got her life all together because now she's married, she's got her own family, but that lady is still traumatized. And that's why I want to ask Mrs. Yemi Oludele-Dare, can you share with us what some signs of trauma will be? Obvious signs, inconspicuous signs, please.
All right, thank you. Because trauma is the damage done to a person's mind as a result of those distressing events. You will find such people having unpredictable emotions. For instance, today they are happy, they are fulfilled. The next minute they are sad, they have mood swings, they are snappy, they are angry for sometimes no reason. They are bitter, they are grieving, they have mixed emotions.
I think our guest is.
As a matter of fact, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Yes, so as I was saying, the unpredictable emotions that comes as a result of the abuse that is triggered, they fluctuate, their emotion fluctuates. They are happy this moment, they are sad the next moment, they are snappy, they are angry, they are bitter, they are grieved. And sometimes you even find people, as a result of the trauma, they are physically sick, they are physically unhealthy, they are constantly sick, and that comes with a ripple effect. You just find these people imbalance in their emotion, you find them imbalance in their physical health, and those are like some of the symptoms you would see around a traumatized person, triggered from time to time.
Thank you, Yemi. Shazmin, I'll come to you now. Yemi speaks about triggers. What are some of the triggers? And I would like you to speak from your experience. What are some of the triggers that bring about trauma?
I think the biggest thing that comes with trauma, I would say the first thing a lot of people don't realize, when being abused is you never really blame the abuser first. So you will most likely always blame you. You always feel you did something wrong, something's wrong with you. You'd relate it probably to childhood where you probably didn't fit in, mother, father, brother, family unit. Probably came from slightly dysfunctional family unit, and then you look for a partner that would complete that. And then the abuse starts from there. But because you didn't fit in originally, somehow you feel that as you're being abused, it's your fault. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. That's something that people take time to come to terms with. And this is why there's that love-hate relationship with the abuser, because they will abuse you. But the minute they say sorry and they apologize, you don't have self-worth, you don't have self-confidence. So the minute your abuser says sorry, you feel okay. And so you look to live in a very safe place. You look to really belong in a relationship like that, because you don't realize your worth is higher than being in an environment like that. So I would say when you're mostly being abused, something people don't realize is the abuser has triggers that trigger them, and that will cause them to abuse you. Your triggers are more from a memory point of view. So you'll be around a certain environment. You could even watch a movie, you could watch family, you could watch, you could watch certain instances going on, and that triggers for you to be able to be like, that's what I went through with my mother, my father, the person I'm in a relationship with. So for example, my story is kind of very, very different, very unique, because I got married at 18 because I was pregnant. So I literally got married within a week. The partner I married was 12 years older than me. So literally he was also thrust within a week into an environment that he had never been in. This is really interesting because he started to physically abuse, well, it started actually verbally. So because that's easier. So it's easier to verbally abuse someone. It's easier to emotionally abuse somebody. And then with time, when an abuser gets comfortable with that because you stay, then they learn to physically also abuse you, and they test out, will you stay, will you walk away, is the apology enough? Because normally the apology after an abuse, it's unlike anything you ever experienced, because they're so heartfelt sorry, they're crying, they're sobbing, and you almost feel the need to protect them, to care for them. So you sort of still put yourself aside in a situation like that. And so what was interesting was I went through that for about 5 years before I would say I grew up and got some self-confidence and worth, and then I left. But what was interesting about my situation was, I guess I didn't allow what I went through to sort of dictate who I would be, who I would become, if that makes sense. I was so fixated on the fact that I'm young and I have this little boy who was my son that I have to take care of, and I needed to be an example for. And that's one of the reasons I sort of left the line I was in to go and study. How do you get over this? How do you move through this? Because I would sit with friends that would listen to the story and get the attention from the story or the sympathy from the story. But then I'm still left going home with the trauma of what I've gone through. It's not solved. And so one of the reasons that I went and did the courses with Tony Robbins was because I was like, how do people get through this? They have to be other women out there that are as lost as I am. So what was interesting in this case was when I moved away with my story to heal, to learn, to grow, so did my husband. So in that time, a lot of people who would have left an abusive relationship, especially the way mine was, because I couldn't go back home. So literally my husband had all the power to be able to do what he was doing, because I was this little girl with the baby. Where do you go? And he knew that. But the funny thing is, he also had time to heal and realize what he did was wrong. And a lot of people would never come back together in a situation like that. But my husband and I actually did. After what I learned and I healed and I forgave and I grew inside, so did he. And so we literally were married for 5 years, divorced for 3, and then we've been together ever since. And I have a 16-year-old son with me today. And the crazy thing is that he turned out to be the person that I actually met. So it showed that it was something that I learned with the trauma that he went through, which was being thrust into a situation which was completely different from being abused. But his trauma was actually from financially not being able to provide and then abusing, which was kind of the other way around. So he was dealing with being in a situation, which I realized after coaching and working with so many people, a lot of people will be in situations that are so toxic to themselves, that are self-inflicted, and then they go ahead and they have no place to vent that because they don't know how to take what's going on inside of them, and they throw it on and abuse the person the closest to them because they assume that person will take that pain and stay. So they abuse and throw on their pain onto you. And so that was another way that I learned of looking at abuse, was people inside are so broken and so hurt, and they don't know where to take all of this. So the closest person to them most likely is the person that gets the full throttle of the wrath.
You're right. The person closest to the one who has gone through trauma, or who is the abusive individual, the persons closest to them get the full blast of their wrath. And the question I have for you, just for you to answer briefly before I move on to our next guest, is, did you know, were you aware, Shazmin, were you aware that you were being abused? Were you aware?
I don't think in the beginning I was, because I was aware it was different from the way I was. Like my father was my dad, you know, kind of like you're like the princess and you're taken care of and you're so loved. But because you get into a relationship with the person who loves you, you don't differentiate in the beginning physical pain, verbal abuse, emotional abuse to it's very tough to see two worlds apart, because you're very torn as to what you're doing wrong. Why you causing that? Why you causing the abuser to be that way? There's a lot of self-blame in the beginning. You don't realize it's them doing to you. You feel it's you creating this situation.
Thank you for that. And that leads me to this question, Mr. Matthews. I'd like you to just give us an idea of what you feel about this, that some people do not acknowledge that they have been through a traumatic experience, or that they are on the receiving end of abuse. Or some people are not aware, they don't even know that they are being abused. They don't even know that they're going through a traumatic experience. Why? How does that happen?
Yeah, in psychiatry, there's something we call insight, which in psychotherapy, psychology, we call it awareness. Just like Jasmine said, Jasmine, thanks for that openness, for sharing your experience. It's really appreciated. Like Jasmine said, when she began to have that experience, she was much younger. And insight is a big thing. And also there are a lot of factors, especially in the climate where we are in Africa. There's some kind of abuses and impact of the abuses that has been seen as a cultural thing. You understand? So sometimes there are perceptions. So I call them perceptions or ideas that somehow that tend to suppress what people see trauma as. So that means there's a lot of misconception. So if a guy is psychologically abused, like some of us that our parents, they abuse us psychologically, emotionally, and verbally. And in Africa, during when we were much younger, it was seen as a way of life. But thank God now, exposure is coming. People are getting more aware. Education, light is coming into it. So a lot of the time, the environment where an individual find themselves sometimes does not help us to define what abuse really are. So lack of understanding, lack of awareness, lack of insight. So if you don't even know, a lot of people don't even know they have mental health problem because they don't even have insight. A lot of people I've had to involve in about 3 cases this week, and this one of them was a man that was a bank manager, and until the matter became so worse, it deteriorated to the stage it is at the moment, they didn't even realize that this was a severe mental illness. I also had another one is an addiction, and so there is a lot of it got to do with our issue with awareness, insight, enlightenment, education, having people getting illuminated to know what an abuses are, what trauma is, so that when they realize, they can then look for it. When you don't know the right diagnosis, the intervention will be wrong. So people need to really first understand it so that they will know what intervention or prognosis that will be prescribed. So I think the key thing, especially in Africa, the key thing is awareness, education, insight to understanding, because abuse is large, is huge. I know in our discussion, our focus is in the relationship, but even in the relationship, there are different kind of abuse and even every day we keep discovering new form of abuses. So abuse is quite very big, and I hope like programs like this, we'll have more programs like this to bring awareness and insight into this element that is so distressing to a lot of people, and a lot of people never recover from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Indeed, it's very distressing. And without even going into something as hectic as maybe sexual abuse or physical abuse, I think about the society in which we have grown up with. Majority of us right now on this platform, we're Nigerians. And I must say that is a society where verbal abuse is like almost a natural thing. If you're going to engage with someone, you are engaging with them from such a disrespectful point of view because of the manner of communication and speaking. The way people speak to domestic staff, the way people speak to employees, the way we engage with it it's in an abusive fashion. Now you take someone who has been socialized like that. We don't know better. You get into a relationship, you get into a marriage, and you end up speaking to your spouse in such abusive ways, and you don't even realize that both of you are being emotionally or verbally abusive towards one another. And that's why I asked that question about, is it possible that we're not even aware that we are engaging in abusive behavior because of this kind of socio-cultural factors, factors in our environment that has made it almost normal to accept, abuse without understanding the traumatic effects that it will have on the individual going forward. Mrs. Oludare, can we have your opinions on that? Your opinion on the fact that some of us may not even be aware that we have undergone trauma and we're in an abusive situation. How does that happen?
Thank you. So while Matthew was talking, something crossed my mind that I remember in my childhood. Is a personal experience, and I think that looking back now, it's just exposure, the awareness. We don't even know in these things. We don't even see it as a crime. We don't even see it as a wrong. It just feels normal to us because in this climate where we are, there's a way our parents talk to us. We talk to friends, the way.
Oh, our apologies. I think we have lost Mrs. Yemi Oludare. I'm looking for her here. I don't see her. Okay, so I welcome BA. I don't know your full name, but you're welcome. Tosin Babalola, thank you for joining us. Is there any other person that I haven't given a very warm welcome? Onyeka Odiatu, thank you for joining us this morning. If we have questions or we have comments on the topic of trauma and abuse in relationships, please feel free to drop us those comments and those questions in the chat section. We will be glad to have them. Bolanle E, thank you for joining us this morning, and as well as Shola, thank you. Is Yemi Oludelidare back? Yes,
I'm back.
she is. Please
Yes, I
continue.
am. So I was saying that as a child growing up, there's just the way people talk to you. And I grew up like that, thinking that, not knowing that it was wrong. Until recently, when I began to parent myself, I had a child, and I discovered that I was doing stuffs with this child. I didn't know they were wrong until the child relocated to another country, to America to be precise. And sometimes when we talk, she tells me stuff like, do you know that some of those things you used to do to me back then, they were traumatizing? And I go speechless, like, I am so sorry, darling. They were never intended. I didn't know better too. I think now I am learning, I am realizing that some of those things were absolutely wrong. They were so inhuman to say to somebody else, but I didn't know better too, because I grew up, to hear those things as normal. And now I have another child, and I'm so conscious what I say, how I say it, and when I say it. I am open to apologizing when I notice that I slip something wrong out of my mouth. I'm quick to say, oh, sorry, baby, sorry, I didn't mean that. This is what I was trying to say. Okay, let's do it this way. I am gentle in my communication. I listen more. I just realized that some of these things I grew up with, I didn't know better. I just didn't know it because I hear them. My auntie says them to me. My mother says them to me. My father says them to me. My uncle says them to me. Neighbors, aunties, uncle, we hear them everywhere. So it didn't come like they were wrong. But now I know better. Now I'm also teaching people, you don't have to talk to your children this way. You don't have to talk to your staff this way. You don't even know what they are going through. You don't know what's on their mind. So all of these things, we just need to put more awareness out there. We need to help people to know. We need to help people to talk better. We need to help people to we need to teach people how to listen, how to communicate. And I think a bulk of these abuses, number one for me, comes from verbal abuses, the things we say out of our mouth, even before we act, even before we do stuff, the things we say. For somebody who is about to rape another person, the first few statements that will come from the mouth is hurting enough, even before the act itself.
Okay, I'll just take over from. Thank you, Yemi Oludelidare. We'll just wait
A
for her to
lot
log
of
back
work
on.
needs to be done. A lot of
Okay.
work needs to be done, and hopefully we'll get better. Thankfully, there's internet, there's technology, social media. The world is one now, so we can pass these messages across in subtle ways, and hopefully the world will become better in every clime, in every continent. Yeah.
Thank you, Yemi. You say something that hopefully we will do better. And I believe that when we know better, we will do better as long as we're willing. And that is why we have this kind of conversations, so that in our circles, we know better, and then we can do better. And as we do better, hopefully we influence others around us to also do better. We have a question from Zipporah, and I'd like Shazmeen to take that. And she says, can one assume that all abusers have been abused? So hold on to that. Before you answer that, the question I have is, picking up from what Yemi has just said about, it took a relocation, a physical or geographical relocation for there to be a relearning, of things, so that there can be a change in the way the relationship is between herself and her child. The question I ask is, what are the effects of trauma and abuse? How does that affect someone's functioning? Before we even, then I'd like Mr. Segun Matthews to take it to the effect on relationships. So Shazmeen, the effect of trauma and abuse on one's individual functioning, And then Mr. Shegun Matthews will take up that further with how does trauma and abuse affect relationships?
Okay, so if I was to answer the question, so she says, can one assume all
abusers have been
abused? So that's a very, very interesting question, because for example, when my husband was abusing me, I think he came from a background where, you know, your teachers hit you, your parents hit you, they were doing it out of love to reform who you are. I came from a background where I had never been smacked or slapped in my life. So on the other side of it, there was verbal abuse from my mom. So, you know, it's interesting, because if you look at who he is today, nobody would ever believe he could have done some of the things that he did. So in the grand scheme of things, there are a lot of abusers that do abuse because there's pain inside, and they will inflict pain within people around them because that's all they know. They don't know better. At the same time, there are a lot of people who have never been abused, but in another form, maybe not physically abused, but emotionally and verbally abused. Later on, that pain tends to come out when it's accessible. You know, it's like a vessel. You're triggered in a certain environment and a certain situation, and it will happen. So something I've seen a lot is with couples, it's very easy to verbally abuse, and it's very easy to emotionally abuse. Not everyone reaches the standard of physically abusing each other, but you don't even realize how much damage you do with the little fights, and how easy it is to be able to just say certain things that you know will hurt and cut through somebody so easily. And as partners, you have the upper hand of knowing your partner, and you know exactly what to say, how to say it, and how it will hurt and damage the other person, without people realizing, okay, you know, some people walk away and hold on to that emotionally. They're not able to ever let go of some of the things that are said. So it's not always somebody who has been abused will abuse. If I throw some light, I don't know if anyone's ever had time to watch some of the series on Netflix, the documentaries that work on crime, and they end up talking to some of the people that are in maximum prisons. When you look at 99% of the people that are in that environment and have caused or killed or murdered or are in maximum prison, it's because of their childhoods. They were neglected. They were brought up just on the streets. Nobody loved them. Nobody cared for them. So at some point in time, they didn't know better. And them just doing what they did just sort of happened. It just came about. And when people interview them and you watch it on Netflix, it blows my mind to be able to see that from a lack of love, it's a child that just wanted to belong and couldn't belong, and just spends time in life trying to fit in whatever way they can, but they end up belonging into a group that's abusive. But that's where they fit in because they don't know better. And now when they're sitting in jail and they're being interviewed and they think back to what they did, they turn around and say, but we just didn't know better. So it's very interesting to see some people that do abuse realize that they did do it, but they just didn't know better. That was the life they came from, the lack of love they came from. And I think, like, as human beings, we all look eventually to belong. That's something we crave. So not all abusers abuse. That's something I've learned.
Thank you, Jasmine, for that. So Zipporah, your question is answered. I hope that provides a bit of clarity on that not all abusers have been abused. What I pick up here is sometimes it could be other influences in life. The need to belong now motivates or influences someone into abusive behavior. All right, thank you for that, Jasmine. But you haven't answered the question about how does abuse affect one's functioning?
Oh my God. I guess that's one of the ways, you end up seeing post-traumatic stress disorder comes about, eating disorders, suicide, because when you are abused, it puts you out of your element. As human beings, we're born to love, we're born to belong. Like even as babies, you crave touch from a mother. You see the consequences of not touching a child when it's a baby and how they grow up versus children who are touched, loved, cared, and nurtured. So I would say the side effects of trauma, one of the biggest abuses people don't talk about is emotional abuse. I think that's one of the most silent ones. The physical abuse, a lot of people are talking about that, bringing awareness to that, sexual abuse, but people don't realize the side effect of emotional abuse, because you've got to really be able to be aware that you are emotionally abused, you're feeling pain, you're living pain. And the side effects of that. So that leads people sometimes to anorexia, to being bulimic, to feeling depressed. For soldiers, you look at their lives, post-traumatic stress disorder from certain situations. So I would say the side effects are huge, they're massive, but one of the biggest ones is suicide now, because you look at the rates of suicide just even from, emotional abuse or verbal abuse just through social media. It causes people as human beings to feel so attacked and so vulnerable, even though you're not in front of the person that is attacking you. But comments and triggers can push you to want to commit suicide, which is what's happening to the younger generation right now, because you don't fit in, you don't belong. But that all falls under emotional abuse, because you could verbally say something, but it stays with somebody for a very, very long time.
Thank you for that. And I think we should talk a bit about emotional abuse later. But in trying to connect this, the issue of emotional abuse from with trauma and abuse, I'd like Mr. Matthews to just explore the area of trauma and abuse affecting relationships.
Okay,
How
thank you.
does trauma, or how can trauma and abuse affect relationships?
Okay, thank you. I always like to simplify views. So I hope I'll be allowed a bit of time, because it's quite huge.
Please go ahead.
Okay, one thing we should know about trauma is that the impact on the individual is subtle, and it can be outrightly destructive to that individual. And I also want us to pick this word, survivor or victim of trauma, victim of abuse. Trauma is the normal way they manage abnormal situation, is a normal response to an abnormal situation. So if I go into drugs in the way to manage the abnormal event that has happened into my life, that's the way is a normal to that person. And how does it impact on the person, and how can it impact on a relationship? I usually break it into 4 parts. There's a cognitive impact, there's an emotional impact, there's a physical impact, which is called physiological impact, and also there's a behavioral impact. I will relate this to the relationship, and I'm going to be using experience that I've come across in the course of my practice. So you imagine somebody that has been abused, or somebody that grew up in a very dysfunctional upbringing, and they have witnessed abuses from significant people in their life. Okay, let me. I've this week alone, I've seen 3 people that were sexually abused from the age of 6, one till she was 13, another one till she was 16, another one, the one from 8 to 16 years. And cognitive. Okay, there is this guy is a musician in my country now. I remember when I met him about 2016, and he's a gospel musician, and he's having a homosexual tendencies. And being a gospel musician, he felt it is abnormal for him to be having that, and he's had some homosexual contacts. But when we explore his life, we realize that his mother messed up seriously with the dad. The mother did some very grievous thing. The mother slept with many, many young guys on their street, and the mother slept with a lot of her father's tenants. The father owns the house, and the mother slept with a lot of the tenants. One very bad circumstance incident was the mother slept with he has slept with the tenant, and there's a younger brother of the tenant that that relocated to Lagos, and the mother was sleeping with the younger brother. And the mother's sister, who happened to be my client's aunt, she witnessed, she saw them, and she threatened her own sister that she's going to report her to her husband. Can you imagine that the mother, who's happened to be the senior sister, kidnapped her own sister and hid her somewhere for 30 days, just because so that she won't reveal the incident to the husband. And this guy grew up in that kind of environment. And for him, in his mind, unconsciously, he has introjected, there's something we call, he has swallowed the father. Women, they are no go. Women are full of troubles. And that has impacted on how he sees marriage. And that influences him going into homosexual relationship. I've also, so cognitively, how can that affect somebody? Once you are experiencing this kind of event, adverse event, there are messages he has dropped in your mind. And if they are negative, we call it maladaptive thoughts. If they have put maladaptive thoughts in your mind, you're going to carry these thoughts, these wrong thoughts into relationship. I remember seeing a woman early last year, and she has gone through abuses like this. And I asked her, and she was having problem with her husband. And I asked her, when you see your husband, or you imagine your husband, what do you think? She said she imagined her husband as full of wahala. In my country, they call wahala trouble. So imagine somebody seeing her partner as trouble. So she's invariably going to be reacting very defensive or very offensive because she has a perception that this guy is full of trouble. And that she picked that up from where she grew up. So perception we bring into cognition, perception, cognitions are thoughts, perception, idea we have about something. So trauma abuses, they leave an impact on us. We interpret abuses in different way. And interpretation we give these abuses, they have a way we see things that try to remind us of those abuses. And then we try to manage them as if we are engaged in those abuses. One thing I should tell you about the brain is that the brain does not recognize if events are current or they are past. The brain deals with images. So what tends to happen when victims of abuses, when they begin to recall or they remember experiences and adverse experiences that happened in the past, the emotion that follow those experiences usually get evoked, because the brain, as it is playing out the experience, the person is feeling as if they are in the experience again. So the emotion that experience evoke in the person comes alive. So that's why we see when some people remember, when they remember those abuses, sometimes they could be tearful, sometimes it could be depressive for the person, sometimes it can cause them fear and anxiety, as if the event is happening afresh. So that's why it deposits in the mind. The other thing is emotional, just like sometimes, so there are emotional implications, consequences that happen when somebody has been involved in abuses. And sometimes, so when they take into a relationship, you imagine that it's going to affect how they connect with the other person, with their partner. And also physiologically, like Jasmine have mentioned and Yemi Oludele Dari has said, a lot of the time, there could be physical consequences. The physical consequences could affect the person eating habits. Some people could eat excessively, and some people could avoid food. So there will be problem with diet. So imagine somebody coming with this kind of physiological problems. Sometimes it affects people's sleep. So imagine if a partner does not get good sleep, and you will imagine that they are not going to function very well, because if you lose sleep over time, it's going to affect your orientation. It's going to affect your concentration. It will make you fatigued. It will make you agitated, irritable, cranky, and all sorts. And you're going to be reacting. You're going to be oversensitive to a lot of things. Your interpretation of events will change. Okay, let me also. There are two incidences that I handled recently. There was this lady one of the ladies that was raped by a teacher and by aunties and the cousin while she was growing up. So you imagine, she said, whenever she sees babies as young as 6 months to 3 years, whenever she sees babies and she sees their penis, she's attracted to fondle with their penis. One of them, she said, one of the ways she manages that she avoid anywhere where a baby will be naked. The other one, she's suffering with a personality disorder at the moment, and she does all kinds of things. Even though she's in a relationship, she's sexually addicted. That when I started seeing her, she threatened me, said, "Mr. Segun, if you keep seeing me, I'm going to fuck you." So you can imagine. And she's in a relationship, and imagine if she goes into a relationship. In fact, she's in a relationship and she sleeps with everybody. There's even one that she told me that she has to pay for the hotel room whenever she had these sexual urges that are very uncontrollable. She will pay for a guy, and she will go and have it, and she will go and have a sex. And this has affected her in tying down in a relationship. It has affected her in having a long-lasting relationship because sex is a big thing for her. And she said, there are only 2 guys that have ever satisfied her, and she knew there were the people that were not going to marry her. And so she's struggling. And she also holds a very high position in her church. And all these things, whenever some people come to her and they propose marriage, and she feels that, no, there's no way I can be a good wife, because she feels that as much as this person is a good person, there's no way I will manage my sexual life because I will keep having sex with random people. So imagine how that will impact. And if she eventually marries, if this matter is not managed, it's not dealt with, she's going to carry this into a relationship, and there's going to have a ripple effect, and the circle will continue. Because when she keep doing that, the potential person that will marry her, she's in a relationship with, we continue to abuse her, and this will perpetuate that trauma, and then she will continue to cope with some maladaptive way to continue to cope with this in this kind of habit. And the last is behavioral. So the behavioral, someone has gotten abuse, they've been traumatized. There's a way it will impact on their behavior. There's a client I saw recently that, for some reason, because she was raped by some armed robber when she was very much younger, she's always threatened that somebody is going to, and okay, her father abused her mother, and the father abused them emotionally as well. She's always threatened because of the behavior of her father, she's always threatened that she's so paranoid that her husband is going to do the same. And there was a time she was violently, physically aggressive, abusing her husband because of the fear of the paranoia she's having, that at some point the husband will leave her just like her father. So you see a cumulative of events. She was raped by robbers, and then her father abused her mother, and they went through a lot of abuse as a consequence of her father's action. So you see how it's so easy to bring consequences of abuses and adverse experience that's happened in the past, how they can destroy a part of our life, and we continue, and we carry this all along, and they tend to become that person, and the person take this into the relationship. So the person have dysfunctional behavior, they have maladaptive way they are coping with the effect of those abuses, and this maladaptive way they bring it into relationship, and then it continues to become a circle. And somehow this is what happened, where somebody, it appears as if they had the kind of experience that their parents had. And in Africa, and we tend to look at it as a spiritual thing. We call it ancestral kind of tradition. So because they don't realize the biological and the behavioral psychological impact that these are conditioned the person and the person keep functioning in that conditioning, and they keep having experiences like their parents have had, and they tend to spiritualize it, not realizing that is a conditioning that attracts the similar experience. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that deep, explanation on this issue. The way you have just linked it, from the cognitive aspect all the way to the behavioral, it shows us that this issue of abuse and trauma is deep. Please, can we please mute our mics, please? Yeah, so that the audio doesn't interfere with the audio here. And I'm thinking, are we just with the conversation we're having this morning, with how deep this issue is, I'm just wondering, are we even chipping off like a fingernail-sized bit of this problem? Because it is so vast, it is so deep, but I think with one conversation after another, we will be more enlightened. Mr. Matthews spoke about insight and awareness. So I guess with one conversation after another, we will gain more insight, we will develop more awareness about these things, and we are able to help ourselves, whatever it is we identify maybe in our personal lives. And as well as we hopefully will be able to use the information to also help the people around us. From Mr. Matthews' point, having spoken about individuals who have experienced abuse and traumatic, experience, they have been on the receiving end of traumatic experiences from a long time ago, and we still see the dysfunctional behavior that they are exhibiting, even now, years afterwards. The question I have for Yemi Oludele-Dare is healing from trauma and abuse possible? I know we have a very wonderful example of that in Shazmin, because Shazmin speaks about her experience. But then you listen again to the examples that Mr. Matthews, shares with us this morning, and you begin to wonder, is complete healing from trauma and abuse possible? Mrs. Yemi Oludele-Dare.